we're going to go ahead and get started with our guest speaker. We have Dr. Laura Gentry from the University of Illinois. She's a research assistant professor in crop sciences department from 2010 to the present. Before then, she was an assistant professor of soil science at North Dakota State University. She received her master's and PhD in soil science from North Carolina State, and she is originally from North Carolina. She resides on the Illinois Corn Growers Association as a director of water quality and research, and she's an adjunct assistant professor in natural resource and environmental sciences at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. So, without any further ado, we're going to allow Dr. Gentry to give her presentation, and then I'll be back after that with some more information about this technology.
I thank you all very much for giving me this opportunity to share a little bit of the research that we're doing in the crop physiology lab at the University of Illinois, and especially what we're doing in regards to stover removal and nutrient management in continuous corn systems. And I'd like to start by acknowledging my co-authors, Mr. Kyle Vogelzang and Dr. Fred Bilo. Kyle was a graduate student working in this research project with us, and he was responsible for 100% of all of the roots that were dug during the course of this project, and that was a thankless, dirty, arduous job. And he was also instrumental in managing this study and implementing a lot of the treatments for it. And so now Kyle is working at Evergreen FS in Evergreen, Illinois as a crop consultant. Dr. Fred Bilo is a professor of crop physiology in the crop sciences department at the University of Illinois. And Fred is the head of the crop physiology lab here at the U of I, and he was the person who actually originated the original project that this study that I'm presenting today was based on, or was sort of a follow-up to. The original study was initiated in 2003, and it was an investigation of the causes of reduced yields in the continuous corn system compared to corn following a soybean crop. And we refer to that difference between continuous corn yields and corn following soybean yields as the continuous corn yield penalty. And it's usually about 15% or 25 bushels per acre throughout most of the corn belt. It varies, but that's usually a pretty good estimate, and that's the difference between what you would see in a continuous corn system versus a corn following soybean. And we wanted to better understand that. So we established these large, long-term blocks of continuous corn and corn following soybean. And that is also what this new study that I'm presenting today, we went right back into those same plots to continue on the study to look at the effects of stover removal and nutrient use. So this original study, the first one, where we were just investigating what's causing the continuous corn yield penalty, that we published in the Agronomy Journal last year. It was myself and Fred Bilo and Dr. Matthias Rufo, who now works at Mosaic Fertilizers, but he was a postdoc on this research project. And in that analysis of our data, we produced a model, and that model determined that there were essentially three main factors that are causing yields to be lower in continuous corn systems relative to corn following soybean. And you can see that I highlighted here in this last sentence here the summary of that, which was that the three agents that are the major factors causing the continuous corn yield penalty are reduced nitrogen in continuous corn systems, and that's really talking about the immobilization of nitrogen by the corn stover, which has that high carbon to nitrogen ratio. The second factor was all the buildup over the years of corn after corn after corn. That stover can build up to a significant level, and that residue has biological, chemical, and physical factors that all combine together to reduce yields in continuous corn systems relative to a corn following soybean or another crop. And then the last factor was weather, and especially what we found was that the continuous corn system is not as resilient to drought, especially as is a corn following soybean. So the yields are going to be more detrimentally affected in a continuous corn system than they would be in a corn following a soybean crop if we have a really bad drought. So those were the three factors that we found, and we know we can't control the weather, the third factor. As far as the nitrogen availability and the nitrogen mineralization, there are some new innovative products, such as the Agricen products, the Accomplish LM in particular, that do address nitrogen mineralization in a really unique way with their biological products. We, in this follow-up study, were really more interested in looking at the corn, directly looking at corn residue accumulation, and so we wanted to see what happens if we just remove some of that residue. And so our hypothesis for this study was that if we removed part of the stover, in our instance we removed 50% of the stover, we thought that we could reduce or even eliminate the continuous corn yield penalty. But we know we don't just go in and pull off 50% of the corn stover in a field year after year and not expect there to be some repercussions of that. There are always follow-up effects because everything affects other things in the system. It's all one system. And so the major factors that we were most concerned about were the nutrient availability. When you remove stover, there's a lot of phosphorus and sulfur and zinc in that stover that you're taking off. What is the effect of removing that on the following yields if we don't replace it? And then the second thing we were really concerned about was soil organic matter. We don't want to reduce soil organic matter by removing all of that carbon that's contained in the corn stover. We don't want to reduce soil organic matter to some detrimental level. So to address that soil organic matter issue, we thought maybe we could increase the plant population in a continuous corn system. What if we increase the plant population, which by doing so, we hypothesized would increase the root biomass? That's pretty reasonable to think. We thought that on a per acre basis, a higher plant population would have more roots below ground. As it turns out, roots are actually a very good carbon source and can build soil organic matter, do build soil organic matter in every system. And so we thought by increasing the below ground root biomass, we could offset what we're removing above ground with our stover harvest. So the questions we were asking in this study were, first of all, does stover removal actually increase our yields in continuous corn systems? And then second of all, with stover removal, what are we doing to our fertility requirements? Do we need to alter those, and how? And then lastly, our questions about plant population in continuous corn systems. First of all, can we increase plant populations, and will that increase yields? And second of all, will increasing the plant population increase our root biomass? So those were the questions that we really wanted to address. Again, this study went right back into our previous long-term study, and what I'm showing you here is a picture of one replication of the 4 full replications that were out there in the field for this study. And so we had one replication which would consist, first of all, of 2 large blocks of our rotation crop. So on the left, what you see is we're getting ready to plant. This is in the spring. We're looking south here, and we're getting ready to plant our 9th year of continuous corn. So on the left, you see 8 years of accumulated corn residue. On the right-hand side, you see a soybean plot, and we're getting ready to plant our long-term corn into our long-term corn following soybean rotations treatment there. Now, we wanted to address what happens when we remove 50% of the stover from this. So to do that, just in our continuous corn system, because we don't think it's going to be sustainable to remove stover from a corn soybean system, we take our continuous corn whole plots and we divide those in half. And from one half of it, we retain all of the stover. And on the other half, we remove 50% of the stover. And we do that by flail chopping the whole field. We take off 100% of the stover, as much as we can. We weigh all of that. And then we replace 50% of it back on the field, and we distribute it evenly with a manure spreader. So that addresses our stover removal question. And so our last question is, what happens in regards to our plant population and our nutrients? To address that, we apply what we call an addition-omission study to each of these larger plots. An addition-omission study is something that we developed here in the crop physiology laboratory. It is a way to address a number of different questions with using a fairly limited number of what we call technology factors. In this case, we have 5 technology factors, and those are fertility, nitrogen, genetics, plant population, and fungicide. Each one of those 5 technology factors is applied at a lower, or what we call a standard level, and at a higher, or what we call an advanced level. And in this slide you can see that we're applying all of the lower levels, we're showing that in orange, and then the advanced levels we're showing in blue. So for our fertility factor, what we're really talking about is non-nitrogen fertility, and specifically we're focusing on phosphorus, sulfur, and zinc, because those are the ones that have our highest harvest index, what we're removing a lot of with the grain. So we're concerned about those. So our lower, or our standard level of that, is not to apply any phosphorus, sulfur, or zinc, and that's based on our soil test recommendations for phosphorus. These were fairly high phosphorus testing soils. The lowest one was about 18 part per million phosphorus, using the Bray method. And then on average, though, it was like 26 part per million. So we were not in a range that would necessarily recommend applying more phosphorus to these fields. But to look at the advanced level of that, we then applied 100 pounds per acre of a product called Micro Essentials SZ, which is an enhanced MAP product that's produced by Mosaic Fertilizers, and it's got an added sulfur and zinc. So it's got a formulation of 12, 40, 0, 10% zinc, 10% sulfur, 1% zinc. To look at our nitrogen technology factor, for that factor, our lower level was 180 pounds of nitrogen applied pre-plant as UAN, and our advanced level was the same amount applied pre-plant plus an additional 60 pounds of nitrogen applied as a side dress at V5 as a stabilized urea product. And then in terms of our genetics, we're really talking about insect protection in this case. So for our standard level of that, we just used a Roundup Ready Refuge hybrid. And for our advanced level, we took that same hybrid, but with the triple stack corn borer and corn rootworm protection. So that was the triple stack hybrid. For our plant population, it was just 32,000 plants or 45,000 plants per acre was our lower and our higher level. And then finally, our fungicide technology factor was for our lower level, no fungicide, versus a strobilurin-containing product that we applied at Silpink. So those are our 5 technology factors. But today, because of our interest and because of time, we're just going to look primarily at our fertility, our phosphorus, sulfur, and zinc, our nitrogen, and our plant populations. So let's look right at our yields. Begin with our 2011 yields. What I want you to look at here, please, is first of all, we're showing our 9th year continuous corn treatment. And that's both with all the stover retained here and with all the stover removed here on the right. And then we follow that up with our corn following soybean yield. So you can see, are we overcoming the continuous corn yield penalty? How do these values compare to corn following a soybean crop? And of course, all the stover was retained for that because we didn't have a stover removal treatment there. Now you'll see we have these technology treatments. And these are just various combinations of those technology factors that I was just showing you. So the high-tech technology treatment consists of all 5 of those technology factors applied at the advanced level. So you have higher plant populations, the additional 60-pound nitrogen side dress application, you have the phosphorus, sulfur, zinc application, the corn rootworm, corn borer protected hybrid, and the strobilurin product. So all 5 of them apply to the advanced level. The high-tech minus fertility treatment here that you see is the high-tech treatment, but we just omit the phosphorus, sulfur, and zinc application. So everything else is at the advanced level except we don't apply phosphorus, sulfur, and zinc. The high-tech minus nitrogen, again, it's all those high technology factors. So it's the high inputs, the extra phosphorus, sulfur, and zinc, all of those except for the additional 60 pounds of nitrogen side dress. The traditional technology factor is all 5 of those technology factors applied at the lower or the standard level. So it's the lower plant populations. And no 60-pound side dress, no extra phosphorus, sulfur, zinc, the refuge hybrid, and no strobilurin. Likewise, the traditional plus fertility is the traditional treatment plus the additional phosphorus, sulfur, zinc, and the trad plus nitrogen is the traditional treatment plus the extra 60 pounds of side dress. So what we are looking at here now are our yields, and the first thing I'd like to take a look at is what happens when we remove 50% of the stover from this system. Did we get a yield increase? Well, here in our high-tech treatment, all the additional inputs in the high plant population, yeah, we got 19 bushels per acre additional yield, so that was very encouraging. And then I'd also like to point out here that we actually, by removing the additional stover, that 50% stover, we overcame the continuous corn yield penalty because we met and exceeded the corn after soybean yields. So that was very encouraging. In the traditional system, though, with our lower inputs and our lower plant population, we really didn't get a significant yield increase by removing 50% of the stover. So we can conclude that the biggest advantage of stover removal came from that more intensively managed, high plant population, high input system. So let's just focus on that one. So what happened here when we don't apply that additional phosphorus, sulfur, and zinc application? When we omit the phosphorus, sulfur, and zinc, but the stover is retained, nothing significant happened, really. We did not lose or gain a significant amount of yield as a result of that. But let's look at what happens here when we don't apply the additional phosphorus, sulfur, and zinc, and the stover was removed. We lost 38 bushels per acre. This was by far the most significant yield reduction in this system. And this really speaks to the value of that stover for as it degrades and decomposes, releasing these important nutrients. So this tells us you really do need to reapply those nutrients if you're going to remove the corn stover. So we conclude that when the stover was retained, eliminating phosphorus, sulfur, and zinc didn't have a big yield effect. But when the stover was removed and you don't apply the phosphorus, sulfur, or zinc, you can expect some very strong yield reductions. Now let's see what happens when we don't apply the additional 60 pound of nitrogen side dress application. Well, in our continuous corn system with the stover retained, we did get a significant yield reduction. We lost 8 bushels per acre. But when the stover was removed and we didn't apply the 60 pounds of nitrogen side dress, we lost 20 bushels per acre by not applying it. But the other thing that I think is really interesting about this is I'd like for you to compare, please, the high-tech minus nitrogen in the stover removed system, 165 bushels per acre with no 60-pound side dress, versus in the stover retained system with an additional 60-pound side dress. They're essentially the same yields. So what this is telling us is that by removing our stover, we were essentially giving ourselves a 60-pound per acre nitrogen side dress in that particular year. We wouldn't expect that in every single year, but this is telling us that that stover really ties up a lot of nitrogen and as it's decomposing. And so we do eventually get that nitrogen back, but within that growing season, we're losing a lot of the nitrogen we apply. So if we remove some of that stover, we can expect to get we don't have to apply the same amount of nitrogen to get the same yields. But if we do apply that 60-pound side dress, we get a greater response. We got 20 bushels per acre yield increase in our stover removed system. So this is telling us two things. First, when stover is retained in a high-tech continuous corn system, we do lose yields if we don't apply that nitrogen side dress. But if we do remove the stover, two things happened. First of all, we could reduce our nitrogen fertilizer requirement essentially by 60 pounds per acre and get the same yields we would have if we'd retained the stover. And second of all, the system became a lot more nitrogen responsive. So if in a stover removed system you apply that side dress application, you'll get a greater yield increase than you would if your stover was retained. Again, it's just talking about how much nitrogen is being immobilized by that stover. All right, so now let's look at our 2012 yields just quickly, because if you'll recall, and I don't think any of us can forget, 2012 was a dramatic drought throughout all of the Corn Belt, and we had strong yield reductions. And I think, though, what's really interesting about this is how much more of a yield reduction we got in a terrible drought in our continuous corn system. We lost, on average, 54 bushels per acre in our continuous corn relative to our corn following soybean across all of our field trials in 2012. So this actually really reinforces what we found in our previous study in the paper where we published our model, and we said that weather, especially bad weather, has a more significant effect in continuous corn than in corn following soybeans. That corn after beans is just a more resilient system. So let's just take a look, though, at what happens when we remove the stover in our continuous corn system in a drought. this was very interesting, I thought. We still got an 18 bushel per acre yield increase by removing the stover, even in a terrible drought. If you recall, in 2011, we got a 19 bushel per acre yield increase. So we are essentially getting the same yield advantage from removing stover even in a bad drought. But you'll also notice we don't even come close to overcoming the continuous corn yield penalty, because there's still such a dramatic difference between continuous corn and corn following beans. The other thing, in a traditional lower input, lower plant population system, we didn't see that much of a benefit from removing 50% of the stover. So we conclude that, again, the real advantage of stover removal has to come from this more aggressively managed system. All right, so that's really what I wanted to share about the root yields. So now, if I could, I'd like to talk a little bit about our root biomasses. And if you will recall, what we were testing with these by looking at our root biomasses was this hypothesis that if we increase the plant population in continuous corn, we would increase our below ground root biomass on a per acre basis, which we thought would offset some of our stover removal issues, such as reducing soil organic matter. Well, what we found was that there was indeed a very strong effect of increasing plant population in continuous corn, but it actually was in the opposite direction of what we had hoped for. When we increased plant populations, we strongly reduced our per plant and even our per acre root biomasses. And that effect was actually a lot stronger in continuous corn than it was in corn following soybeans. And then there was another significant effect from the plant populations on our roots, and that was what we found was the input effect. And in general, what we found was that when we applied more inputs, especially more nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, and zinc, it generally had a very positive effect on the root biomass. More inputs meant more root biomass. So what we have here is a picture that is a really good demonstration of the typical effect that we found from plant populations and inputs. On the left-hand side, these are both of these pictures are from continuous corn plant roots. The left-hand side shows what we saw when we dug the roots from a lower plant population system with advanced inputs, more nutrients. And on the right-hand side, it shows the plant roots from a continuous corn system with higher plant populations and lower crop inputs. So you can see it's pretty obvious that there was a strong effect of plant population and input on individual plant roots. But what happened on a per acre basis? This is also pretty interesting. It demonstrates the same things that we just showed you in the pictures. And so what I'm going to show you now is the effects of plant population and crop inputs and stover removal on our per acre root biomasses. So on our vertical axis here, we see our root biomasses. It's just showing you how many pounds of roots we had on a per acre basis. And down here, I'm going to show you 4 different treatments on this horizontal axis. We're showing you the lower plant population with higher levels of nutrients, higher levels of inputs, our lower plant population with our lower levels of inputs, then our higher plant population with our higher levels of inputs, and finally our higher plant population with our lower levels of inputs. So I'd like to first begin by showing you data that is representing the continuous corn root biomasses from our stover retained system. So all the stover was left on here, and it's pretty clear what's happening. We see that clearly we had the greatest root biomass from our lower plant populations and our greater inputs, and similarly we had the lowest root biomasses from our higher plant populations and our lower crop inputs. And maybe you're thinking, well, that's really fascinating, but what does that mean for crop yields? Do more roots mean more yields, or is the plant producing more roots at the expense of producing grain? So let's just bring in here our yield data. And so I'm just showing you the yields for each one of those respective treatments. What we see is that the greatest root biomass produced our greatest yields, 194 bushels per acre in this case. And similarly, our lowest crop yields came from our lower root biomasses. So I thought that was pretty interesting. So that again was our continuous corn system with all the stover retained. What happens when the stover is removed? Well, it's a little different system. This is continuous corn with the stover removed. We see that the greatest root biomass came from the lower plant population, but with the lower levels of inputs. So the question is, did this actually produce the greatest amount of yields? Let's see. No, in this case, this was not the greatest yielding system. Again, the highest yielding system was our lower plant population with higher inputs for continuous corn. What we would suggest is happening here is that the plant is looking for more nutrients. Because we're removing 50% of the stover, we're removing a lot of the phosphorus, sulfur, zinc, and nitrogen. So the plant is sending out greater amounts of roots. It's taking its allocated carbon, putting more roots into the ground to find more nutrients, and that's at the expense of yield in this case. And then just as a frame of reference, let's see what happens with our corn following soybean. And all I wanted to show you with this is that it's just not as dramatic an effect. The roots, again, are just more resilient to higher plant populations and to lower levels of inputs in a corn soybean system. The whole system is just a little more resilient. And again, the yields. And so I think this is really telling us that to optimize yields in a continuous corn system, we might want to consider reducing our plant populations but increasing our levels of inputs, especially if we're going to be removing the stover. So let's just go back to our original questions. Did stover removal increase yields in continuous corn? Yeah, it really did, but that was really limited to our more aggressively managed, higher plant population, higher input system. Did stover removal in our continuous corn affect nutrient availability? It sure did. It made nitrogen more available, and it made phosphorus, sulfur, and zinc much less available. You really need to reapply those nutrients. And then, in terms of our plant populations in continuous corn, did increasing plant populations increase yields? No way. Quite the opposite. And did it increase our root biomass? Again, just the opposite. Consider reducing plant populations in a continuous corn system is what this data suggests. We want to thank all of our funders very much. We appreciate their support. You can go to our website here. And finally, I'd like to send out a big thank you to Brian Cornelius, to Stephen Sexton, and everyone at Agricen for giving me an opportunity to share this information. Thanks a lot.